Now, in this session, we are going to focus on mollusks. And we'll begin with Jennifer Mather of the University of Lethbridge in Canada, who's going to talk about the case for cephalopod consciousness. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Good.
Yes.
Well, Jonathan has given a very, very good case for talking about sentience and feelings. But there's many, many different kinds of evidence for consciousness, and there's many different individuals who stress one or the other. The sense of the animal as a self, and the sense of a self as moving through time. The sense of acquiring and using information, and of course, the feelings. Now, because there's so many ways that you might assess an animal's consciousness, Jonathan, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Has actually come up with what he believes are 4 areas of consciousness that we should assess if we want to think of an animal as consciousness. Perceptual richness, unity, temporality, and affect. Next slide. I'm going to have to go through these quite quickly, unfortunately. In perceptual richness, Jonathan suggests acuity, bandwidth, and categorization. Now, acuity is obvious. How good are you at sensing through one particular sense? Bandwidth is a width of range of stimuli that you're sensitive to. This works for vision and audition, and it doesn't work for other capacities. And I'll talk about categorization, which is the cognitive use of these sets of sensory information. But it's particularly interesting to look at the cephalopods in terms of their vision. Yes, they have an eye which is similar to the vertebrate eye. Not the same, interestingly enough, but similar. The major thing that is true for the cephalopods is that they do not have color vision. Instead, they have a dimension which we could regard as parallel to color, which is the discrimination of the plane of polarization of light. And this emphasizes what Jonathan said, of course, that we cannot measure animals by our measures. We have to measure them by their abilities and their competence. It turns out the plane of polarization of light as a dimension of visual sensation is adaptive in the marine environment, good when you're looking through murky water. It's particularly good in terms of breaking the camouflage of some of the species that cephalopods would use as prey. So shiny fish, for instance, and animals that are opaque, they are seen much better if an animal can perceive plane of polarization of light. The other thing that's interesting is that we have studied navigation of cephalopods, and we have used landmarks. We haven't looked at how they're using the plane of polarization of light. And I think it was Cartron who found that given these cues versus landmark cues, they were actually better using navigation with plane of polarization, which of course bees do. So this is something that we need to look at. Next, please. Next. Good. Okay. A second kind of cognitive use of visual information is the extensive work that was done in Naples in the 50s and 60s. The idea was that the animal would come from its sheltering home, would be guided by, as you can see, a visual shape there, and get a reward. And if the stimulus was negative, would get a small shock. Now, what happened with the octopuses that they studied is they first started thinking it would be the vertical and horizontal extent that would allow the animals to understand shape. And in fact, they were very good at that. So then they tried other cues, and they found that octopuses could discriminate squares from circles, could discriminate large stimuli from small stimuli. Many, many sophisticated attributes of the visual stimulus, and Sutherland eventually had to give up and say, we know that the octopus doesn't just discriminate cues. It can decide which cue is important, and then it can use that one. So it's a very sophisticated ability. They're also able to use reversals, where you reward the positive, and then when the animal gets good at it, you turn to rewarding the negative, and they can do this. And something that they can do that is described for humans as a Gestalt perception, that they can use part of the cue and, so to speak, construct the figure in their brain. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. Processing chemical cues is something that many animals are very, very good at, and we're not. And there's both distance and contact chemical cues. In fact, the octopus has suckers with hundreds of chemical cues. It's difficult to talk about bandwidth with chemicals. We know there's rich arrays, no obvious dimensions, many different sources. This Van Giesen paper identified receptors in the suckers, and I'm very, very hopeful that they will begin to be testing animals to see how they can discriminate these chemical cues based on the receptors. So perceptual richness is something that the cephalopods have. They don't necessarily have our perceptual richness, but they have perceptual richness. Next, please. The next characteristic Birch suggested was unity, and you need to look at this through laterality, through central peripheral allocation, and also sensory integration. Now, it was the people in Naples who really looked at laterality, because they stimulated one side of the animal with either visual information or tactile information, and then checked to see if the animal was able to use this information if the stimuli were then given to the other side. And by the way, this picture illustrates that the octopus is generally monocular. So what you have is unilateral input. Usually an octopus will be in a sheltered home and look out at you with one eye, or it will follow a visual stimulus with one eye. So that caused people to say, well, maybe there's a division of perception and perhaps even cognition on each side of the brain. And it does turn out, in this case it's the cuttlefish, they're specialized in using one eye for a class of stimuli and another eye for another class of stimuli. Nonetheless, what the Naples people found out is that storage was initially unilateral, but then bilateral. So there's a sense in which input is unilateral, but storage is bilateral. Next, please. There's another problem that we have with the octopuses. With 3/5 of their neurons in the arms, people have said, oh, but it's really got a separate brain. And some of the wild claims suggest that there's a separate brain in each of the arms, which is foolish. But Frank Grasso has an excellent paper where he talked about how the computation of all the neurons in the arms could actually make a separate representation. I don't think it does, okay? What's going on is that there's a great deal of sensory motor coordination in the periphery, which there has to be. And because of this coordination, the animal is able to use the arms in very, very sophisticated ways. But it's not making decisions with them. What's happening is the brain is making these decisions. And in fact, there's just a recent paper that talked about how an animal can learn a discrimination using one arm, and then it can carry out the same discrimination using a different arm, which suggests that the animal central decision-making is what's going on. Next, please. As I said, going quickly. I'm going to try to give information from field work as much as possible when I'm talking about temporality, because I think it's so important that we understand what the animal's doing where the animal lives. Temporality suggests that the animal is aware of past events and also predicts future events, so that the animal is not situated just in the here and now, but situated across time. And there's a lot of evidence that the animals remember past events and use them. In fact, it's a very, very long time since I did observational work in Bermuda with octopuses. And I found that they had a central home where they would be sheltering. And they would go out from the home and hunt. For one day, they would go in one particular direction, come back. So they clearly had spatial memory. But the next day, they would not go hunt in the same places. And this is very interesting, because if you think about it, this is wind switch foraging. And it makes complete sense for an octopus, because if you find a crab underneath a rock, there is not going to be another crab magically appear in the rock the next day, maybe in a week. So they're clearly able to do this, remembering what has happened in the past and use it to control their behavior. And cuttlefish, when given a lab test, can do pretty well the same thing. They can do what's called episodic like memory. They can remember what stimulus, where the stimulus is, and they can remember where the stimulus is across a different time. So it's a what, when, where. Not only can they remember past events, cephalopods can remember events or remember information and plan for the future. And again, this is in octopuses, the famous coconut carrying octopuses on Australia. You see, they're very vulnerable. And so they have to be very, very careful that they're near shelter or that they have some shelter with them. And these octopuses found coconuts that had been split apart by humans and went off hunting in the sandy mud where there was no shelter. And they did so carrying the divided halves of this coconut between their arm web. And after a while of hunting, they stopped, picked out the coconut halves from underneath their web, opened them up, climbed inside, and found themselves the perfect shelter. So this has to be preparation for the future. Now, there's some very interesting studies going on in the lab with Schnell and colleagues, where they're looking at this kind of thing in terms of what is it the animals are planning for the future. And one of them is called delay of gratification. This is for children. This is called the marshmallow test, which is appalling. But anyway, they gave the cuttlefish two different pieces of food, one of which they knew was preferred. They could take the less preferred food immediately, or they could wait and take the more preferred food after a certain duration had elapsed. And they were able to do this. They were able to delay gratification, which is a very good test of cognitive ability in small children of the human species. They've also looked at prediction of the availability of prey in the future. So they found that if they had the opportunity to take a less preferred prey versus later, preferred prey would come. And this was daytime to evening. And if the preferred prey would come predictably, they would not take the non-preferred prey. Whereas if the preferred prey would come unpredictably anytime they didn't know when they would get it, then they would take the unpreferred prey. So it's very clearly planning for the future. Next slide. Now, Ginsberg and Jablonka have suggested that consciousness should be indicated by unlimited learning. And there really isn't any such thing as unlimited learning. There's stereotyping, there's imprinting, which is genetically controlled timing and type of learning. And every animal has to have some kind of compromise, even if it's a learning specialist, in what is controlled and what is possible in terms of variability. Nonetheless, if you look at cephalopods, particularly octopuses, no, not necessarily octopuses, all of the cephalopods, you find that they have variable prey choices. And in fact, in one study that we did, we looked at the prey choices for the species, that was Octopus insularis, and then we looked at the prey choices of individuals, and we discovered that while there was a very, very wide variety of prey for the species, so it looked as if an octopus was just taking whatever was in front of it. Nonetheless, individuals in many cases were specializing. They were learning where a particular prey was, what they would have to do to get it, and specializing in it. Similarly, there are very, very flexible anti-predator responses. And in this case, this is true for octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid, which is interesting because we don't study squid enough. They're difficult to find. And I think they have, as Jonathan suggested, their particular variety of abilities, which is not exactly the same. But one cuttlefish study stands out for me, where the cuttlefish have a startled response to potential predators. And this is big dots on the dorsal surface, so they look like a big two-eyed animal rather than a small animal. And what they found was that the cuttlefish only made these dots to predators that hunted by vision, many of the bony fish. They didn't make them to fish such as sharks, small sharks, who hunt by chemical cues. So what the cuttlefish had learned is that this particular response wasn't any use for this particular set of predators, but was useful for another set. Next slide, please. There's not enough time. This is why I had to go so fast. Now, the fourth thing that Jonathan mentioned for evidence was affective, and this is what he has particularly stressed in his presentation. The idea that stimuli around you have positive and negative valence, and particularly, it's the situation of pain is so obvious for all of us. I haven't thought as much about this one as I'd like to. I haven't thought as much as all the others. It's actually quite challenging to decide what it is that an octopus likes or dislikes. And so one of the things is that they're very strong food preferences. Octopuses will do pretty well anything for crabs. It's also true that they very, very much need shelter. So I think that these are probably stimuli in the environment that the octopus in particular has positive valence for. And there are probably negative environmental factors that we haven't worked out very well. For instance, octopuses often at night want lower light. And so if they're given control of their environment, they will actually act to turn off the light. Now, there was one in the Seattle Aquarium that acted to turn off the light by shooting a jet of water at the light over its tank and shorting out the light. So there's clear indication that it didn't like it. Next, please. Jonathan emphasized very strongly, I think, that as he said from demonstrating Robin Cook's work, that pain is a stimulus situation that we can look at in terms of valence. The problem with looking at pain is that it has three different dimensions. It has sensory, cognitive, and affective dimensions. And we really can't say that it's pain. I mean, it's true. We got this from studies of humans, but I think that it is probably reasonable for non-humans. And the nociceptors and the sensory stimuli, that's very obvious. And Robin's studies suggests that the cognitive evaluation of pain is very clearly there in the octopuses that she studied. But she did say that the affective dimension was present, and I think it's very, very difficult for us to say we know what an animal feels. And by the way, this picture is an octopus that has been given a shock with the crab and the white square, and remember where it was previously coming out of its home to try to grab the crab. It's now hiding and refusing to even touch what has given it a painful stimulus. So it's very clear that there is pain, and it's just not clear just exactly whether it has all the dimensions that we expect of it. Next, please. If we're looking at, back one. If we're looking at Birch's question of this accumulation of information in consciousness, I think the cephalopods pass. They may not have every single one. This is one reason I asked Jonathan that question. But they very clearly have many of the capacities that he considers to be necessary to say an animal has consciousness. But it's not our kind of consciousness. It's not social. These are not, for the most part, they are not social animals. So you run into problems with the squid because they are much more social. And I think for the octopus in particular, there's two fairly strong dimensions. The dimension of curiosity, which is very, very curious animals, exploratory, very much so, versus fear. So I think these are motivational bases. But I would argue, and I hope you have liked the evidence here, that I think that cephalopods do have consciousness. They just don't necessarily have what we would call the same consciousness we have. Next slide. So that would leave me time for questions. I guess perhaps running over a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Yeah, we will have a couple of questions because I think the plenary discussion that I scheduled in later will be quite hard to do with the chat box, and I think people would probably rather have the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions so we can pinch a little bit from the discussion time. So would anybody like to ask Jennifer a question? You can either use the chat box or unmute yourselves. Oh, here we go. There's one from Nicholas. Jennifer, can you see Nicholas's question in the chat box, or would you like me to read it to you?
Since I haven't figured out where the chat box is, why don't you read it?
Okay. Is there some kind of useful scale or something else to use when thinking about and distinguishing between consciousness and sentience and otherwise?
No, there's no understood and agreed upon distinction. And it really is a problem in a sense that we use different words for what I think is the same capacity. Maybe Jonathan can answer that as well.
Okay.
It's a problem. Language is subjective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you actually want me to answer as well?
Just really briefly, I think, Jonathan, and then we'll go in the other because there are people in the other room which I hadn't realised. So
well, really briefly, yeah, these terms do
it.
have different senses, and one just has to be clear about which sense one has in mind.
Okay, thank you. That was very brief. Very good. Okay. So, given that there are people in the other room, perhaps we'd better move over. Oh, not very many yet. I think most are still in here. Right. Okay. In that case, there's actually a question for Jonathan in the chat box. Jonathan, can you see it?
I can see it, yes. Yeah, the question is about should one remove the concept of conscious experience or self-awareness from the definition of sentience? Well, I think when one talks about feeling, we are talking about conscious experience in the most basic elemental ancient sense, just this sense of there being something it feels like to be you. And I think that can be distinguished from self-awareness. I think there could be animals that are sentient in that sense, but that do not have any particularly high degree of self-consciousness, and that there's more on that in the dimensions of animal consciousness paper that I linked to in the chat. Yeah, so I do think sentience implies conscious experience, but only in a very basic elemental sense that is about having feelings rather than reflecting on them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you very much, Jennifer, again for a really fascinating talk.